The morning of July 15, 2024, started like any other summer day at Lake Tahoe. The sun reflected off the crystal-clear waters, now lower than anyone could remember. California's worst drought in decades had dropped the lake's water level by nearly 30 feet, exposing beaches and rocky outcroppings that hadn't seen daylight since the 1960s. Two kayakers enjoying the calm morning waters near Tahoe Vista noticed something unusual jutting from the newly exposed lakebed. What they discovered would finally answer questions that had haunted three families for 28 years. Before we begin the story, let us know in the comments which city you're watching from. We're really curious where you're tuning in from. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel and leave a rating. The green roof of a 1994 Ford Explorer emerged from the receding waters like a ghost from the past. Inside, investigators would find the remains of Richard Hartley, his wife Linda, and their 17-year-old daughter Ashley. The Hartley family had vanished without a trace on July 4, 1996, during what was supposed to be a celebratory Independence Day weekend at the lake. Their disappearance had become one of Northern California's most puzzling missing persons cases. Now, nature itself had provided the key to solving it. Richard Hartley had been 42 years old that summer of 1996, a successful software engineer riding the wave of Silicon Valley's tech boom. His company, Data Sync Solutions, had just secured a major contract that would set his family up for life. Linda, 40 years old and a dedicated high school English teacher, had been looking forward to their annual summer vacation. Their daughter Ashley, just 17 and about to start her senior year, had dreams of attending UC Berkeley in the fall of 1997. The family portrait that emerged from old photographs and interviews painted a picture of American success: hard-working parents, a bright daughter, and a future full of promise. 3 days before their disappearance, on July 2, 1996, something had shifted in the Hartley household. Richard had been reviewing college recommendation letters for Ashley when he discovered something troubling. Among the papers on his home office desk was a background check he'd run on Ethan Cross, the 24-year-old graduate student who'd been tutoring Ashley in calculus for the past year. The check had revealed sealed juvenile records that shouldn't have been accessible, but Richard's connection at the courthouse had provided more information than usual. What he found made him cancel a business meeting and spend the entire evening locked in his study. The investigation would later reveal that Richard had written notes in the margins of a draft recommendation letter: assault with deadly weapon, age 16, sealed but verified, must discuss with E before proceeding. These notes, preserved in the waterlogged but still readable papers found in the Explorer, would become crucial evidence 28 years later. But on that July evening in 1996, Richard had kept his concerns to himself, not even telling Linda what he'd discovered. Christopher Marino, Richard's business partner at DataSync, remembered that week clearly, even after all these years. Richard seemed distracted those last few days, Marino would tell investigators in 2024. We were in the middle of finalizing a huge patent deal, and suddenly he was worried about his daughter's college applications. It didn't make sense at the time. Marino, then 38, had been pushing Richard to sell their software patent to a major tech company. The deal would have made them both millionaires, but Richard had been hesitant, wanting to maintain control of their creation. The tension between the business partners had been building for months. Email records recovered from old servers showed increasingly heated exchanges about the company's future. Marino wanted to cash out quickly, while Richard believed they could build something even bigger if they remained independent. 3 weeks before the family's disappearance, Marino had threatened legal action if Richard continued to block the sale. "I'll do whatever it takes to make this deal happen," one email read. "Don't stand in my way, Richard." Then there was Daniel Foster, the 35-year-old owner of Foster's Marina, the last place anyone had seen the Hartley family alive. Foster had run the marina for nearly a decade, building a reputation as someone who knew every inch of Lake Tahoe's shoreline. Local police files from 1996 showed that Linda Hartley's phone records included several calls to the marina in the weeks leading up to their vacation. When questioned at the time, Foster had said they were simply inquiries about boat rentals and lake conditions. But the frequency of the calls, sometimes 2 or 3 per week, suggested something more. On the morning of July 4, 1996, the Hartley family had checked out of the Tahoe Vista Lodge at 10 a.m., telling the desk clerk they planned to spend the day on the lake. Security footage from a nearby gas station, grainy and barely visible, showed their explorer heading north toward Foster's Marina at 2:30 p.m. Richard had stopped at an ATM, withdrawing $500 in cash, an unusual amount for him, according to banking records. Friends and family would later say Richard rarely carried more than $50 at a time, preferring to use credit cards for everything. At 3 p.m., the marina's rental log showed the Hartley family name, signed in Daniel Foster's handwriting. They had allegedly rented a small motorboat and safety equipment for a 4-hour excursion. Foster would later claim they seemed excited about spending the afternoon on the water, though he noticed Richard appeared tense. The husband kept looking at his watch, Foster had told police in 1996, like he had somewhere else to be. But there was another person who played a crucial role in those final hours: Ethan Cross. The young tutor had arrived at Lake Tahoe that same weekend, though he would later claim to have been in Sacramento visiting family. Pager records from 1996, primitive by today's standards but still traceable, showed his pager had been forwarded to a Tahoe area number starting July 3rd. When confronted with this information back in 1996, Cross had explained it as a technical error, saying he'd been helping with the search efforts and must have set up the forwarding after hearing about the disappearance. Cross had presented himself as the concerned family friend from the moment the Hartleys were reported missing. He'd arrived at the Tahoe Vista Lodge on the evening of July 4th, claiming he'd come as soon as he heard they hadn't returned. He organized search parties, distributed missing person flyers, and served as a liaison between the family's friends back home and the local authorities. His dedication to finding the Hartleys had impressed everyone, especially as he continued to follow the case for years afterward, even attending annual memorial services. The last confirmed sighting of the Hartley family alive came from a tourist couple from Germany who had been taking photographs at Emerald Bay. In one of their photos, time-stamped at 3:30 p.m. on July 4, 1996, the Hartley family's Explorer could be seen in the background, parked at a scenic overlook. The photograph, discovered only when investigators made a public appeal in 2024, showed something else: a figure standing near the vehicle, too blurry to identify clearly, but definitely not one of the Hartley family members. Ashley Hartley's diary, found in their hotel room after the disappearance, revealed the teenagers' growing unease about something in the days leading up to their vacation. Most entries were typical teenage concerns: friends, summer reading assignments, anxiety about senior year. But a hidden entry, written in the margin of a page and discovered only when investigators used special lighting techniques in 2024, read, "E has been acting so weird lately. Dad noticed too. Why does he keep asking about our vacation plans?" The Tahoe Vista Lodge held on to the Hartleys' belongings for 3 months before turning them over to authorities. Among their personal effects was a waterproof Kodak camera, one of those disposable ones popular in the 1990s. The film inside had captured 35 photos of their vacation. Richard and Linda smiling at breakfast, Ashley rolling her eyes at her parents' tourist behavior, scenic shots of the lake. The 36th and final photo, however, was different. Blurred and apparently taken accidentally, it showed a figure approaching the camera, only their torso visible in the frame. The clothing matched what Ethan Cross had been wearing in a photograph taken at the Volunteer Search Center later that evening. As the hours turned into days in July 1996, the search for the Hartley family had intensified. Local authorities, assuming the family had suffered a boating accident, focused their efforts on the lake itself. Dive teams searched the waters near Foster's Marina, helicopters scanned the shoreline, and volunteers combed the hiking trails. Daniel Foster himself had volunteered his boats and personal knowledge of the lake to aid in the search. That family was so full of life, he'd told reporters at the time. "I can't believe they're gone." Christopher Marino had flown up from San Francisco as soon as he heard about his partner's disappearance. He'd offered a $50,000 reward for information and had hired private investigators when the official search was called off after 2 weeks. But his efforts had also raised suspicions. Investigators learned that Marino had filed paperwork to take full control of DataSync Solutions just 5 days after Richard's disappearance, citing a clause in their partnership agreement about incapacitation of a partner. The investigation in 1996 had hit dead end after dead end. Without bodies or the vehicle, authorities couldn't determine if they were dealing with an accident or something more sinister. The boat the Hartleys had allegedly rented was found drifting empty near the eastern shore 2 days after their disappearance, with no signs of distress. Life jackets were still neatly stored under the seats. The key was still in the ignition. It was as if the family had simply vanished into thin air. The cold case unit that reopened the Hartley investigation in 2024 had access to technology that didn't exist in 1996. DNA analysis, digital forensics, and enhanced photo examination revealed details that had been invisible to investigators nearly 3 decades earlier. Detective Sarah Chen, who led the renewed investigation, started by re-examining every piece of evidence with fresh eyes. The first major breakthrough came from the waterlogged papers found in the Explorer. The recommendation letter draft, preserved between pages of other documents, showed more than just Richard's concerns about Ethan Cross's background. UV light revealed additional notes written in pencil, nearly faded but still readable. Meeting with E tomorrow. Must protect Ashley. Linda doesn't know yet. This indicated Richard had planned to confront Cross before their vacation ended. The timing suggested this confrontation might have occurred on July 4th, the day the family disappeared. Christopher Marino's alibi for July 4, 1996, began to crumble under scrutiny. He had claimed to be in San Francisco all day, providing receipts from a gas station and restaurant as proof. But when Detective Chen examined these receipts using modern forensic techniques, she discovered something suspicious. The thermal paper had degradation patterns inconsistent with the printed dates. Further analysis revealed the receipts were actually from July 3rd, chemically treated to appear aged differently. Someone had deliberately altered the dates to create a false alibi. The investigation turned up another fascinating detail about Marino's movements. Credit card records, stored in banking archives and newly digitized, showed he had purchased a one-way airline ticket from Sacramento to San Francisco on July 4th at 11:45 p.m., hours after the Hartleys had vanished. Why would someone need to fly from Sacramento to San Francisco late on Independence Day if they had supposedly been in San Francisco all day? The flight manifest confirmed he had indeed taken that flight, suggesting he had been much closer to Lake Tahoe than he'd claimed. Meanwhile, Daniel Foster's story began showing cracks as well. The marina log entry for 3 p.m. on July 4th had an unusual characteristic that paper analysts noticed only with modern techniques. The ink density suggested the entry had been written over something else, possibly changing the time. When investigators applied chemical restoration techniques, they could see the ghost of the original entry, 5 p.m. Someone had altered the time to make it appear the Hartleys had rented the boat 2 hours earlier than they actually had. Phone records from 1996, preserved on microfiche and newly digitized, revealed that Linda Hartley had indeed called Foster's Marina multiple times in the weeks before their vacation. But investigators discovered something the original investigation had missed. The calls weren't to the marina's public number. They were to Foster's private office line, a number not advertised to customers. When pressed about this in 2024, Foster, now in his 60s, claimed he couldn't remember the specific calls, but suggested Linda might have been planning a surprise for Richard's upcoming birthday. The investigation took an unexpected turn when Detective Chen decided to re-interview everyone who had participated in the original search efforts. Many volunteers had passed away or moved, but she tracked down 63-year-old Patricia Wong, who had coordinated volunteer assignments in 1996. Wong had kept meticulous records, including sign-in sheets and time logs. Her records showed that Ethan Cross had signed in for the evening search meeting at 8 p.m. on July 4th, but several volunteers remembered him already being there when they arrived at 7:30 p.m. He was very helpful, almost too eager, Wong recalled. He had maps of the area already spread out, had divided up search zones. It was impressive for someone who claimed to have just arrived from Sacramento after hearing the news. Wong's records also showed something odd. Cross had volunteered to search the areas furthest from where the family was last seen, directing other volunteers to focus on the marina and main lake area while he took groups to remote northern sections. The pager records from 1996 provided another crucial piece of evidence. While Cross had claimed the forwarding to a Tahoe number was a mistake, investigators found that the forwarding had been set up on July 2nd, the same day Richard discovered Cross's criminal history. The forwarding number belonged to a payphone at a gas station 5 miles from the Tahoe Vista Lodge. Security footage from that gas station, stored on old VHS tapes in the owner's basement, was barely viewable, but showed someone matching Cross's description using that phone multiple times between July 2nd and July 4th. Detective Chen's team made another discovery when they examined Ashley's diary more carefully. Using infrared photography, they found indentations on blank pages where Ashley had written entries that were later torn out. Through painstaking reconstruction, they recovered fragments of text. E got angry when I said I might switch tutors, and Dad said to stay away from, with the rest torn beyond recovery. These hidden messages painted a picture of escalating tension between the family and Ethan Cross in the days before their disappearance. The investigation revealed that Cross's behavior after the disappearance followed a peculiar pattern. While he appeared dedicated to finding the family, he consistently steered search efforts away from certain areas. He had convinced authorities that the family, unfamiliar with the lake, would have stayed close to marked boating lanes. He argued against searching near the remote northern cliffs, claiming the family wouldn't have ventured to such dangerous areas. Yet, the final photograph from the Hartley's camera showed distinctive rock formations that geological surveys identified as being from exactly that northern region. As investigators dug deeper into Cross's past, they uncovered more than just the sealed juvenile record Richard had discovered. Cross had been arrested at age 16 for attacking a teacher who had threatened to report his cheating on an exam. The assault had been serious enough to require hospitalization, though Cross had avoided jail time due to his age and a plea deal. Throughout his academic career, he'd shown a pattern of explosive anger when his carefully constructed image was threatened. In 2024, Cross was living in Portland, Oregon, working as a successful corporate trainer. He had built a reputation as a thoughtful, intelligent professional with no hint of his troubled past. When Detective Chen first contacted him about the reopened investigation, he expressed surprise but eagerness to help, just as he had 28 years earlier. He flew to California voluntarily, presenting himself as someone who'd never gotten over the tragedy of losing the family he'd grown close to through tutoring Ashley. During the interview, Cross provided detailed memories of July 4, 1996. He claimed he'd been at his parents' house in Sacramento all day, arriving at Tahoe only after hearing about the disappearance on the evening news. He said he'd immediately driven up to help, arriving around 8 p.m. But when Detective Chen presented him with the pager records showing forwarding to Tahoe starting July 2nd, Cross's demeanor changed. He became agitated, claiming the records must be wrong, that technology from the 1990s was notoriously unreliable. The financial investigation revealed another layer to the story. Cross had been struggling financially in 1996, barely making ends meet as a graduate student. But immediately after the Hartley's disappearance, he'd paid off significant student loans and moved to a better apartment. When questioned about this, he claimed to have received an inheritance from a grandmother who died that summer. However, genealogical records showed all of his grandparents had died years before 1996. Daniel Foster's financials also raised questions. His marina had been struggling before the summer of 1996, with records showing he was 3 months behind on lease payments. But by August 1996, he'd not only caught up on payments, but had also purchased new boats and equipment. Foster explained this as insurance money from boats damaged in a spring storm, but insurance records showed no such claims filed in 1996. Christopher Marino's actions after his partner's disappearance painted a complex picture. While he'd gained control of DataSync Solutions and eventually sold the patent for $12 million, he'd also set up a trust fund for Ashley Hartley's college education, not knowing she would never need it. For years, he'd funded scholarships in the Hartley family name. Was this guilt over profiting from tragedy, or something more sinister? The recovered Explorer provided a treasure trove of physical evidence. Modern forensic techniques revealed fingerprints that had been invisible to 1996 technology. Ethan Cross's prints were found on the rear door handle and on the driver's side window, places he would have had no reason to touch if he'd never seen the family that weekend. When confronted with this evidence, Cross claimed he must have touched the vehicle earlier when helping the family load luggage for some other trip, though he couldn't specify when this might have occurred. The vehicle's position in the lake also told a story. Accident reconstruction specialists determined that for the Explorer to end up where it did, it couldn't have simply rolled off a boat ramp or crashed through a barrier. The angle and depth suggested it had been deliberately pushed from the cliff road above, a remote area that locals knew but tourists would never find. The same area Ethan Cross had steered search parties away from in 1996. Inside the vehicle, investigators found something that had been overlooked in the initial recovery: a small digital watch not belonging to any of the family members, wedged between the seats. The watch had stopped at 9:47 p.m. on July 4, 1996. It was a Casio model that Cross had been photographed wearing in college yearbook photos, though not in any photos taken after July 1996. As Detective Chen's team pieced together the evidence, a horrifying pattern emerged. Every piece of Cross's helpful behavior in 1996 could be reframed as manipulation. His volunteer coordination had directed searches away from where the family actually was. His emotional support to the families had allowed him to stay close to the investigation, monitoring what authorities knew. His years of following the case weren't dedication. They were self-preservation, making sure the truth stayed buried. The investigation revealed that in the days following the disappearance, Cross had made several trips to hardware stores, purchasing concrete blocks, chains, and rope. He'd paid cash for everything, but one store had kept carbon copies of receipts for tax purposes. The dates matched perfectly with the timeline of the disappearance. When asked about these purchases in 2024, Cross claimed he'd been buying supplies for search and rescue efforts, though none of the official search coordinators recalled requesting such items. A breakthrough came when investigators found the German tourists who had taken the photograph at Emerald Bay. Now in their 70s and living in Munich, Hans and Greta Mueller remembered that day clearly. They had more photos from that afternoon stored in albums that had never been digitized. When Detective Chen's team examined these photos, they found 3 more images showing the Hartleys' explorer at the Overlook. In one photo, taken at 3:45 p.m., 2 figures could be seen near the vehicle, one matching Ethan Cross's description, the other appearing to be Richard Hartley. Their body language suggested an animated discussion. The medical examiner's analysis of the remains, using techniques not available in 1996, revealed crucial information without graphic detail. The positioning suggested all 3 family members had been in the vehicle when it entered the water. There were no signs of restraints, but trace amounts of a sedative were found through advanced toxicology testing. The sedative was consistent with Rohypnol, which Cross had access to through his graduate research in neuroscience. By late August 2024, Detective Chen had built a compelling case. The evidence pointed overwhelmingly at Ethan Cross, but prosecutors wanted more. They needed to understand the motive clearly. Why would a 24-year-old graduate student commit such a terrible act? The answer lay in Richard Hartley's discovery of Cross's past and what it meant for Cross's carefully constructed future. The case against Ethan Cross reached its turning point when Detective Chen discovered a letter Richard Hartley had mailed to himself on July 3, 1996. A common practice among cautious businessmen to establish dated proof of ideas or concerns. The letter, sitting unopened in a safety deposit box for 28 years, contained Richard's full findings about Cross. Not only had Cross been convicted of assault as a juvenile, but Richard had discovered Cross was using a false academic history. His claimed undergraduate degree from Princeton was fabricated. He'd actually attended community college. His entire graduate school admission was based on forged transcripts. "I plan to confront Ethan tomorrow before we leave for Tahoe," Richard had written. I've already contacted UC Berkeley's admission office about rescinding their acceptance of his recommendation letter for Ashley. This young man has built his entire life on lies, and I won't let him near my daughter anymore. I'm documenting this in case he reacts badly to being exposed. The letter revealed that Richard had planned to meet Cross on July 4th at 4 p.m. at the Emerald Bay Overlook, exactly where the German tourists had photographed them. Richard wanted the confrontation to happen away from his family, somewhere public but private enough to avoid a scene. He'd told Cross he had important news about Ashley's college applications that needed discussing in person. When Detective Chen presented this evidence to Cross in September 2024, his carefully maintained composure finally cracked. For 28 years, he'd played the role of the concerned family friend, the helpful citizen who'd never gotten over the tragedy. Now, faced with Richard's own words from beyond the grave, Cross's demeanor shifted from cooperative to calculating. He requested a lawyer, but not before muttering, "Richard should have minded his own business." The reconstruction of events, based on all available evidence, painted a clear picture of July 4, 1996. Cross had arrived at Lake Tahoe on July 2nd, not July 4th as he'd claimed. He'd spent 2 days following the Hartley family, watching their movements, planning his approach. The forwarded pager number allowed him to maintain the illusion of being in Sacramento while actually stalking the family around the lake. At 3:45 p.m. on July 4th, Richard met Cross at the Emerald Bay Overlook as planned. The conversation, witnessed at a distance by the German tourists, had started calmly but quickly escalated. Richard had confronted Cross with everything: the fake transcripts, the criminal record, the web of lies. For Cross, who'd spent 8 years building a false identity that was about to get him into a prestigious PhD program, this exposure meant complete destruction of his future. Cross had come prepared for violence. The sedatives found in the family's systems suggested he'd planned to incapacitate them if necessary. During the confrontation with Richard, something had gone catastrophically wrong. The investigation suggested Richard had tried to leave to get back to his family, but Cross couldn't allow him to expose the truth. The exact details of what happened in those moments would never be fully known, but the outcome was clear. Linda and Ashley, waiting in the Explorer, had become witnesses Cross couldn't leave behind. The sedatives in their systems indicated Cross had likely offered them water bottles laced with Rohypnol, perhaps claiming Richard had sent him to tell them he'd be delayed. As a trusted family friend and Ashley's tutor, they would have had no reason to suspect him. By the time they realized something was wrong, it would have been too late. The vehicle's path to the water had been carefully orchestrated. Cross knew the area well from his undergraduate years at a nearby college, the real college he'd attended, not Princeton. He knew about the old logging road that led to cliffs above a deep section of the lake, an area where the water was over 200 feet deep. It was a place locals avoided, knowing the dangerous currents and rocky bottom made it treacherous even for experienced divers. At 9:47 p.m., according to the watch that had fallen from his wrist in the struggle to position the vehicle, Cross had pushed the Explorer off the cliff. The depth and cold water temperature meant the vehicle would sink quickly and likely never be found, or so he'd believed. He hadn't counted on 28 years of climate change dramatically altering the lake's water levels. Cross's actions after the murders showed remarkable calculation. He'd walked the 5 miles back to town, arriving at the Tahoe Vista Lodge by 7:30 p.m. to establish his alibi as the concerned family friend. He'd organized search parties, comforted other families, and maintained his facade for nearly 3 decades. His purchase of concrete blocks and chains after the disappearance wasn't for search efforts. It was to ensure the vehicle would never surface if it somehow broke free from the lake bottom. The financial windfall Cross experienced after the murders now made sense. He had stolen Richard's wallet, which contained the $500 from the ATM withdrawal. More significantly, he'd taken Richard's briefcase from the Explorer, which contained signed contracts and technical documents for DataSync solutions. Cross had sold these documents to one of DataSync's competitors for $50,000, claiming to be a consultant who'd worked with Richard. The competitor company had used the information to challenge DataSync's patents, though they ultimately lost in court. Detective Chen's investigation revealed that Cross had nearly been caught in 1996. A park ranger named Tom Rodriguez had seen someone matching Cross's description walking along the highway late on July 4th, seemingly heading away from the cliff area. Rodriguez had even stopped to offer assistance, but the man had declined and quickly disappeared into the forest. Rodriguez had reported this to authorities during the original investigation, but without any connection to Cross, who supposedly wasn't at the lake, the lead had gone nowhere. In October 2024, faced with overwhelming evidence, Ethan Cross finally confessed, though his version of events attempted to minimize his culpability. He claimed the confrontation with Richard had turned physical when Richard had grabbed him, that the deaths were an accident that spiraled out of control. He insisted he'd never meant to harm Linda and Ashley, that he'd only given them sedatives to buy time to think. But the premeditated purchase of the drugs, the elaborate cover-up, and 28 years of deception told a different story. Cross revealed details that only the killer would know. He described how he'd weighted the vehicle's accelerator with one of the concrete blocks to ensure it would hit the water with enough force to sink immediately. He explained how he'd chosen that specific cliff because he knew the lake's underwater topography from a college geology course. The vehicle would land on an underwater shelf that angled steeply into deeper water, ensuring it would slide beyond the reach of standard search equipment. The most chilling revelation was Cross's admission that he'd attended the Hartley family memorial service every year, not out of guilt or remembrance, but to monitor whether anyone suspected him. He'd comforted Richard's elderly mother until her death in 2010, visited Linda's sister when she was diagnosed with cancer, even wrote recommendation letters for a scholarship fund in Ashley's name. Every gesture of kindness had been calculated self-preservation. Christopher Marino, cleared of any involvement in the murders, expressed profound shock at the revelation. "For 28 years, I carried guilt about our business disputes, wondering if the stress had contributed to whatever happened to them," he said at a press conference. To learn it was Ethan, someone Richard was trying to protect Ashley from, it's devastating. Richard died being the protective father he always was. Daniel Foster, similarly exonerated, admitted to the affair with Linda Hartley that had caused his suspicious behavior. "We'd ended it weeks before their vacation," he revealed. "Linda chose her family, as she should have. I altered the Marina log timing because I didn't want anyone to know she'd come to say a final goodbye that afternoon. I was protecting her reputation, not hiding a crime." The recovery of the Hartley family's remains allowed for proper burials, 28 years delayed. The service drew hundreds of mourners, many who'd only known the family through the decades of news coverage. Ashley's former classmates, now in their 40s with children of their own, spoke about the bright future she'd been denied. Linda's fellow teachers, many now retired, remembered her passion for education. Richard's former colleagues in Silicon Valley had established a memorial fund that had quietly supported missing persons investigations for decades. At Ethan Cross's sentencing in March 2025, the full impact of his crimes became clear. Beyond the 3 lives lost, he'd destroyed multiple families' peace for nearly 3 decades. Richard's mother had died never knowing what happened to her son. Linda's parents had spent their life savings on private investigators. Ashley's best friend had undergone years of therapy, traumatized by the unexplained loss. Cross had stolen not just 3 lives, but 28 years of closure from everyone who loved them. The prosecutor read a victim impact statement from Ashley's boyfriend in 1996, now a 47-year-old father of 3. "I named my daughter Ashley. For 28 years, I've wondered if somehow I could have prevented this if I'd gone on that vacation with them as originally planned." To know that a trusted tutor, someone we all thought was helping Ashley reach her dreams, was actually her killer, it's a betrayal beyond words. Cross received 3 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole. At 52 years old, he would die in prison. As he was led away, he turned to the families and said, "I was just protecting my future." The courtroom erupted in anger at his continued self-justification. Even facing life in prison, Cross couldn't acknowledge the monstrosity of choosing his fabricated life over 3 real ones. Detective Sarah Chen received commendations for solving the cold case, but she reflected soberly on the investigation's implications. "This case shows how someone can hide in plain sight for decades," she said. "Cross didn't disappear or create a new identity. He built a successful life on the foundation of triple murder. He attended conferences, got married, had children, all while knowing what he'd done." It makes you wonder how many other Ethan Crosses are out there, their crimes hidden beneath lakes, both literal and metaphorical. The environmental factors that solved the case, the historic drought that dropped Lake Tahoe's levels, led to other discoveries. 5 more vehicles were found in various parts of the lake, solving 3 additional missing persons cases, though none involved foul play. The Hartley case became a catalyst for re-examining cold cases where bodies of water might hold answers. New sonar technology, combined with climate change's effects on water levels, offered hope to other families seeking closure. The case's resolution brought changes to how backgrounds were verified in academic settings. Ashley's death inspired Ashley's Law in California, requiring more stringent background checks for anyone working with minors in educational settings. The law specifically addressed the loopholes Cross had exploited to hide his criminal past while gaining access to vulnerable students. Cross's wife, whom he'd married in 2001, filed for divorce immediately upon learning the truth. She revealed that Cross had always insisted they never vacation at Lake Tahoe, claiming he had bad memories from a friend's death there. Their 2 children, teenagers themselves, struggled to reconcile the father they'd known with the killer he'd been before they were born. They legally changed their last names, not wanting any association with Cross's legacy. The Hartley family home in San Jose, preserved by Richard's estate, became an unexpected memorial. The new owners, learning the history, found Richard's home office virtually untouched since 1996. Among his papers, they discovered he'd been writing a book about internet security, eerily prescient about the digital age's dangers. The book, completed by his former colleagues and published posthumously, donated all proceeds to missing persons organizations. In the end, the Hartley family tragedy served as a cautionary tale about the dangers of deception and the lengths people will go to protect false identities. Ethan Cross had killed 3 people to preserve a lie about his education and past. He'd spent 28 years playing the role of the grieving friend while the family he'd murdered lay at the bottom of a lake. His capture brought justice, but it couldn't restore the years of life stolen from Richard, Linda, and Ashley Hartley. The final truth was perhaps the most tragic. If Cross had simply accepted Richard's confrontation and faced the consequences of his lies in 1996, he would have faced academic disgrace and possibly fraud charges. Instead, by choosing murder to protect his secret, he destroyed 4 families, the Hartleys and ultimately his own. The lake had kept his secret for 28 years, but as Detective Chen noted in her final report, the truth, like bodies in water, eventually surfaces. Lake Tahoe continues to draw millions of visitors each year, its beauty undiminished by the tragedies hidden in its depths. But for those who know the Heartland story, the lake serves as a reminder that beneath placid surfaces, dark secrets can lurk for decades. The drought that revealed the Hartley family's fate was a natural disaster that brought human justice. Sometimes, nature itself becomes the final witness to humanity's darkest moments. As of 2025, Ethan Cross resides in San Quentin State Prison. He has filed appeals claiming ineffective counsel and challenging the forensic evidence, all unsuccessful. Prison records show he works in the library, helping other inmates with legal research, still maintaining the helpful facade that had hidden his monstrous nature for so long. He continues to receive letters from people fascinated by his crime, which he doesn't answer. The man who killed to protect his fabricated identity now has only a prisoner number to define him. The Hartley case files remain open to researchers studying cold cases and criminal psychology. The question that haunts investigators is how many other cases like this exist. Murders disguised as disappearances, killers hiding as concerned citizens, families waiting for answers that lie beneath the surface of lakes, rivers, and oceans around the world. The Hartley family's story ended in 2024, 28 years after it began, but the lessons from their case continue to influence investigations today. The drought that exposed the explorer has since ended, and Lake Tahoe's waters have risen again. The spot where the vehicle rested for nearly 3 decades is once again deep underwater. But the truth that emerged from those receding waters can never be submerged again. Richard, Linda, and Ashley Hartley have been laid to rest properly, their killer imprisoned, and their story finally told. In the end, justice delayed was not justice denied. It just took nature's intervention to reveal what human investigation alone could not uncover.